Welcome back to my channel, God's Hands on the Wheel of Time. I'm Sammy McKee, and this is part of my series on the Antichrist, the three Antichrists that come at the end of each age during the spring season and pave the way for the righteous republic to decline into the evil empire at the start of the new age. So just like there's storms in the spring, the spring is a time of bounty, but it's also a time of change. And in each age, there are these republics that come along, the old kingdom of Egypt, the Roman Republic, and the United States of America, that are really the peak of the time. They're an embodiment of the positive aspects of the age, and what happens over time is they corrupt and decline. Now, I'll talk in a later series on the actual crisis of the late Republic, as I call it. But what paves the way for that crisis and the decline into the empire are the three Antichrists. The first Antichrist in the age of Aries is Alexander, and in the age of Pisces is Napoleon. And that's what this episode today is going to focus on. Now, first of all, when we look at their lives, all the events line up one after the other. And I'll do an entire series on Alexander and Napoleon, breaking them down more specifically and showing these exact correlations on a micro level. But on a macro level, what we see are these periods where, for example, prior to the crowning of Alexander and the crowning of Napoleon as emperor, there were revolutions in Greece and in Europe, the old world, that for about a decade set the stage for their rise to power and their eventual crowning that led to their reign. So what this revolution does is it destabilizes the old world order that had existed since the fall of the evil empire. In Europe, during the age of Pisces, the fall of the Roman Empire, ever since that time, had been the Middle Ages. This social order and this political order that had existed would have never allowed for an artillery general from Corsica, which was what Napoleon was, to become Emperor of France, not just Emperor of France, but Emperor of pretty much all of continental Europe. So this destabilizing revolution in France had to upend that social political order in Europe to be able to pave the way for Napoleon to have even happened. The same thing can be said 2,140 years before in the age of Aries, where going back to the fall of the Bronze Age, and actually before that with the Macedonian invasions, there had been a new order in the Aegean, different from what the Minoans had, practiced as a trade empire with Egyptian influences. The Macedonians come in and they set up the polis, the city-state. That lasts all the way up until we get to the revolution in the Aegean under Philip, the predecessor in the decades before Alexander, that completely reshapes the geopolitical order in Greece. Without Philip, there is no Alexander. Just like without the French Revolution, there is no Napoleon. And these set the stage for what comes. Both Alexander and Napoleon rise through the ranks during this time. Alexander becomes the clear heir apparent to Philip, so that when Philip gets assassinated, it's clear that Alexander is the next king. The same thing can be said for Napoleon. Napoleon worked his way up through the ranks of the revolutionary military and became, the savior of the revolution, and became famous by leading the expedition to Egypt, setting the stage for him to eventually become first consul and then finally emperor later on. Napoleon is crowned emperor 2,140 years after Alexander becomes king of Macedon. And from there, their political trajectories follow the same military conquest. Alexander consolidates power, taking over the Aegean, and then crosses into Persia, wins a series of battles that give him Egypt. On the flip side, Napoleon, rapidly after becoming emperor, wins a series of battles against the coalitions that give him control over all of Western Europe. These two just continue on this path until Alexander has conquered the Persian Empire. He's in Babylon, he's in Susa, he's in Persepolis. He, finds the body of Darius. He is the Persian emperor, if you will, now with an even bigger empire that stretches across into Greece. The same thing happens with Napoleon. He just defeats his enemies one after the other, and his empire stretches from Spain all the way to Poland and everything in between. So just like Alexander and Napoleon win battles and basically never lose, as we look at the flaws that they have, both of their ambitions are limitless. Alexander was offered everything west of the Euphrates and declined it. And then even after finding Darius's body, he doesn't stop there. He continues off into Afghanistan and finally into India. This fateful decision gets him basically bogged down in guerrilla wars. He's overextended. This ambition is limitless. He wants to go all the way to the end of Asia, wants to conquer the world, which is the flaw that brings about his downfall. The same can be seen with Napoleon. Napoleon gets bogged down in this war in Spain and Portugal, where he puts his brother on the throne of Spain and has to fight this guerrilla war where he's committing a massive portion of his army to fighting a never-ending war. That's a bad decision on his part, just like how Alexander's getting bogged down in Bactria and Afghanistan with a guerrilla war. And then Napoleon's ambitions are limitless. They both invade countries that were insane to invade at the time. Nobody else would have done it. Napoleon invading Russia, a terrible decision, leads to his downfall. There's ecological struggles with the Russian winter. There's also, this massive Russian army that is limitless. And, you take Moscow and it doesn't mean that the empire has fallen, right? And then he retreats. Alexander does the same thing. He invades India. It's this jungle terrain. It's really hard on his army. He's fighting never-ending Indian armies and Indian kingdoms with populations like nothing he had ever faced before. He's still scoring victories, but it's, just like Napoleon wins at Borodino and takes Moscow. Alexander's still scoring victories, but it just withers his army down. And then the retreats out of Russia and out of India both cost them the bulk of their forces. Of course, the Russian winter devastates, the Grand Army for Napoleon. Well, Alexander retreated through a desert that wiped out 3/4 of his army. By the time Alexander gets back to Babylon, he's a shell of himself. He eventually recovers, but then dies not long after Hephaestion's death. The same thing happens with Napoleon. It was his downfall going to Russia. When he comes back, the Grand Army's in tatters. He gets defeated. He gets exiled to the island of Ebla and then comes back with 100 days before he's defeated at Waterloo, and finally is exiled to St. Helena 2,140 years after Alexander's death. Now, I'll spend a lot of episodes talking about how their events correlate side by side. But what I'm more interested in with the first Antichrist concept is, what does this figure do historically? And one of the big ones that we have to look at is, what impact does it have on the Republic in causing the Republic to become corrupted? This is obvious to me with Napoleon. Now, you do have to have a little bit of creativity, but Napoleon sells the United States Louisiana, bogs down the British during the War of 1812, and allows the United States, which was in its cradle at the time, to double in size, eventually carry out Manifest Destiny to the Pacific coast, and become a lot bigger than just the 13 colonies. I'll also add that Napoleon's Peninsular War ends up causing the Latin American colonies to break free, which allows for later on the United States to take policies like the Monroe Doctrine, where they become the dominant power in the Western Hemisphere. What this is it's a corrupting factor. Slavery is allowed to spread west and becomes a lot more popular. You have the growth of industry. The United States isn't just this simple republic of 13 states anymore, begins to add states. How are we going to deal with those states? And as I'll talk about in the early parts of what corrupts the United States, this is what leads to the Civil War that happened later, the Gilded Age, if you will, when America becomes imperialistic in the late 19th century, and all these things that happen later on. Alexander has the same impact on Rome. It's very indirect, kind of like Napoleon never went to war with the United States. Rome ends up annexing southern Italy and the Greek states there because of Alexander's conquest of Greece. It creates a power vacuum in Italy. Italy was to Greece what America was to Europe, and they had their colonies there, and those colonies eventually get conquered by Rome. And eventually, one of Rome's major wars that correlates with the United States' Civil War is its war with Epirus, called the Pyrrhic War, where they actually end up annexing all the Greek states, and they win their first major war against an enemy in Greece. That never would have happened without Alexander. And so Alexander indirectly paves the way for Rome, which had been this little city-state in its cradle, to rapidly expand. And eventually that expansion makes Rome more than just a republican city-state, right? It becomes this massive beast that eventually leads to Roman imperialism and what becomes the corrupting factors of the Roman Republic. On the flip side, one of the major things that they both do is they destabilize what was the old order. And I already talked about how the Revolution did that, but these two figures, the first Antichrist, come after the French Revolution and after Philip and talk about really restructure things, right? The Hellenistic kingdoms become the dominant political force, not just in Greece, but in what was formerly the Persian Empire with Ptolemaic Egypt and the Seleucids. And you could even say that the Mauryan Empire in India is influenced by Alexander. Alexander restructures what was the King of Kings idea that had gone back to Mesopotamia. The same thing happens with Napoleon. Napoleon spreads the ideas of the French Revolution. Even the Ottoman Empire, that Napoleon never really directly influenced the way Alexander conquered Persia, goes through a massive reform period where they're trying to adopt the reforms of the French military and of the revolution to try and bring about change. The same thing happens with the revolutions of 1830 and of 1848 that restructure and push back against the old feudal order and force the Austro-Hungarian Empire to eventually fall, Tsarist Russia to eventually fall. You know, there never would have been communism without the French Revolution and Napoleon spreading the ideas of the Enlightenment to the rest of Europe. The same thing again, Alexander, directly tutored by Aristotle, spreads the ideas of Greek philosophy to the rest of Egypt and what was formerly the Persian Empire. And the last thing I'll touch on is that after Alexander, there's the Wars of the Diadochi and the Hellenistic kingdoms that come about. Those directly correlate with what comes about after Napoleon. After Napoleon, the kings of Europe create this concert of Europe idea that they're going to use to stabilize Europe. It's the same thing that comes about after the Wars of the Diadochi. And so what we have is this first Antichrist figure that is this embodiment of the age. And especially like Alexander, you know, fulfills the characteristics of the age of Aries. He leads from the battlefront. He's a hero like Achilles. He exhibits all the characteristics of what a hero in the age of Aries would embody. The same thing can be said for Napoleon. Napoleon is a propaganda master. He's, you know, creating equality in Europe and by ending feudalism. But at the same time, you know, that he's a great military general. He doesn't lead on the front, right? He's in the back, you know, as a general was in the 19th century. And so both of these figures really embody the pillars of their age. In the end, what we have is this first Antichrist figure that has completely reshaped the entire socio-political order in the world and paved the way for what we see during the radical changes of the spring season. I'll also add, which I'll spend an episode talking about, how I believe that Gilgamesh was this first Antichrist in Sumer that ushered in the early dynastic period of Sumer that correlates with Egypt and paving the way for Egypt to have the influence that it did over the Levant. And again, very indirectly, the same way Napoleon and Alexander had indirect influences on the United States and the Roman Republic. But I hope you enjoyed this episode. Thanks for tuning in. Please like and subscribe. God's blessings to all, and thank you.